Hello and welcome to Stars, Cells, and God, the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science that have theological and philosophical implications, as well as new scientific discoveries that point to the reality of God's existence. My name is Hugh. I'm here with Jeff Zweerink, and today we're going to be exploring a couple of topics. But before we get into the discussion, I wanted to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe's YouTube channel, so that you can be notified of our new weekly videos. Learn more at reasons.org or by following us on social media at RTB_official. Well, I'm going to talk about something astrophysical, but you're going to talk about something biochemical. We're both physicists, but what I like about what you're talking about, Jeff, is you're bringing a physics perspective into biochemistry. So take it away for us.
Well, yeah, I am talking about biochemistry, and the particular discovery is related to this kinesin 1 molecule, which is a molecule that transports stuff around the cell. And not really kind of going to delve into the biology much at all, but what fascinated me was just the idea, if I'm honest, that we are interested in figuring out how to do this. And, you know, kind of one of the arguments I'm going to make is that this points to human exceptionalism, because you look at all of the animals out there, and there are some spectacular animals. I mean, you know, you do a lot of photography interested in animals. I like getting out. One of the things that would happen whenever we would travel on our family vacations is whoever spotted the first wildlife always got a milkshake. Now, reality, that was just an excuse to buy everybody milkshakes. But
a squirrel would always be the one, right?
Squirrel, no, so it had to be wildlife. So this wasn't like, you know, cows and stuff that you'd normally see. It had to be a bear or a deer or an elk or something unusual for what was out there.
Okay.
And so, you know, kind of looking for new novel animals or stuff that we weren't used to. But all the incredible animals that are out there and what they do, what strikes me about this is that we are the only animal on the planet that not only says, all right, we need to survive, but we just go out and look and figure out, can we figure it out almost just for the joy of discovering it? And, you know, hopefully as I describe what the discovery is, and I'm less interested in the discovery and the techniques that were developed to allow the discovery to happen.
So where you're taking us is only humans actually study biochemistry and astrophysics.
Well, yeah, I mean, animals will do stuff. I mean, you know, I've seen episodes where birds are figuring out how to do locks but it's always driven by something that's for their survival sake. It's like, how can I get to the food? How can I do this? How can I protect my young? Those sorts of things. At the end of the day, what goes on in the biology of the cell really doesn't have a whole lot to do with our survival. I mean, if we survived for millennia without having any clue what's going on inside the cell or even that cells existed, but yet we not only have this capacity or interest in it, but we have this capacity to figure out how to do it. And that's what fascinated me about this, because the particular molecule in question is kinesin 1. And again, this is a cartoon picture of it. And you've got these microtubule kind of highways that run throughout the cell. And this kinesin molecule actually transport materials along there. And so what it'll do is it'll have a load kind of up at the top there. And just for scale, I think that's about 17 nanometers up above the microtubule is the size of the load.
So these are kind of like semi-trucks on highways.
Well, yeah, you could use that analogy. The reason why I hesitate to call it semi-truck is because the way we've gone in and tried to figure out what's going on with these things is, all right, you've got this molecule. 17 nanometers is not particularly large. How can you get a handle on what's going on with these things? And so some of the things they've done are put large molecules on top that they can grab with an optical tweezer, and so they can hold the tweezer and then track what's going on with the molecule. But the things they're putting on have sizes of, 70 to 500 nanometers. Well, this thing's 17 nanometers high. You put something that size on it, you don't put loads that are huge on top of a semi, because the semi no longer works the way it's supposed to. And that's what they found when they did this. They could put these large loads on. They could use the optical tweezers to hold and kind of see what was going on. but you've introduced this huge disturbance to the way the molecule operates. And so another approach they took was to put fluorescent molecules onto these objects. And so now you could excite them, they would fluoresce, and by tracking, by imaging the fluorescence, you could now figure out where it was. The problem with that is that as these molecules fluoresce, you need to get a bunch of photons, thousands of photons, because you get this blurry blob of photons, but you can localize the center, and that tells you where the molecule or the fluorescent atom or compound is. But it took, like I said, thousands of photons to do that, which means that you had to take many, many milliseconds to collect that number of photons, hundreds of milliseconds. Well, these things move faster than that. And so what you're doing is getting little snapshots that are blurred over long periods of time. It's kind of like going out into the sky, opening up your camera and just letting it go. You're going to get streaks instead of nice, good pictures of stars. And so what they're wrestling with is, how do we develop a technology, or what can we do that allows us to see nanometer size resolution, so where are the elements in the molecule, or in this kinesin molecule, with sub-millisecond temporal resolution. And like I said, none of the techniques that are around had that capacity. And so what they were able to do was somebody came up with this creative technique. It's called min flux, and really what they're doing is looking for what's the minimum flux of photons we can use to figure out where the fluorescent molecule was. And you're dealing with 1 over the square root of n statistics. The more statistics you have, right, the better your resolution is, and so it's really just collecting photons. And so there's really no way to get around that. So what the technique that was developed, and this is where the creativity just I'm like, oh, that is so cool. What they did was said, all right, we've got this fluorescent molecule that we've put on there. We know we can't stimulate it too much or else it's going to quit working, so that also limits how long you can track. We also know that it takes too long to collect enough photons from the fluorescent thing to pinpoint it, that takes too long. So they said, why don't we do this? We're going to take a donut of light and shine it onto the molecule. And if the fluorescent part of the molecule is within the donut, it will not give off any light. So if it's giving off any light, or if we see any fluorescence, we know that it is not at the center of the donut. And so they now can scan across this, figure out where there's no light coming, and they say, now we know exactly where the molecule is.
So they're looking for the absence of light.
Exactly, to tell us exactly where it is. And I thought, right, now that is a cool, creative way to get around this problem. And so what they were able to do in doing that, and these are the two papers that talk about it. It's both of them published in Science. Is direct observation of motor proteins stepping in living cells using min flux, and it dissects the unimpeded walking of kinesin 1.
So they do it in a way where they're not actually impeding the motion of the molecule on the microtubule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's no longer we take it outside the cell and look at it, because now it's not in its environment. We don't put heavy things on top of it, but we can actually just incorporate these fluorescent objects inside the cell, look inside the cell, and track where it's walking. That is a phenomenal accomplishment, in my opinion.
So what did they learn about the walking?
Well, what they learned is that the part on the right here is what is showing is a graph of the distance it has moved versus time. And you can see there's a lot of noise in that. It's fluctuating around. Some of that's statistical or photon collecting. Some of that is, just jitter in the molecule itself. But what you can see is it's kind of taking, 15, 16, 17 nanometer steps every time. And it does so, it takes maybe 8 or 10 steps there every second. In every second it does 10 or so steps in there. But you notice you're getting millimeter type resolution there. So you can see how large each step is when the step happens, and you can track the motion of the molecule. So you're getting sub-nanometer resolution or nanometer type resolution, sub-millisecond timescales on it. And, so this was really cool that they could track the motion of the molecules.
I also notice that it's not all noise. I'm seeing a regular step pattern there,
Exactly.
which tells me it's probably bumping into things as it's going along the microtubule.
Well, actually what you've got, so if you kind of go to the image on the right, what you've got here, these are the 2 feet. And so if we go back to the previous diagram here, which you've got these 2 pads on there, and those steps are where one of those pads displaces in steps here.
Right.
It delimits the
So you're actually able to see that moving from one part of the microtubule to the other as it bumps over those molecules.
Exactly.
That's incredible.
And even more than that, what they were able to do is they were able to attach a fluorescent molecule on one side of the kinesin molecule. And their resolution is so good that what they noticed is that with each step, that molecule flips from front to back to front to back to front to back. So it raises this question, is the kinesin just taking a step and a step and a step and a step? So might it be that it's taking a step, and when it does, the molecule's here. When it takes the step the next way, now the molecule's in the front. Or does it step and, is it pirouetting as it goes down? I mean, you think of what kind of questions we're asking here, that at the nanometer level of molecular motion, is this molecule spinning as it moves along? Is it just taking steps? I mean, this whole scenario just kind of screams, wow, look at the intricacy and the order and the design and the elegance of the cell, for one. But how is it that we are willing and able to invest so much resources to figure out this kind of minuscule, obscure fact that in all likelihood, once we figure it out, that's going to help us build better technologies and do things to benefit humanity. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't have an iota worth of relevance to our survival. It's a great luxury that we have, but yet we're willing to invest the time and the energy to do it. And investing that time and energy is rewarding. It's almost like we're designed to be able to do this. And that's kind of my point, is that we are designed to do this, that this points to human exceptionalism as well as just the intricacy and design within the cell.
Well, I'm wondering if they discuss this in the paper, because I think what would be interesting to me is how does this feature of moving along the microtubule dependent on the load that the kinesin molecule is carrying? I'd be curious, okay, I see this thing that looks like it's doing this. That seems to be the best interpretation of what we're seeing there. But would it change if the load is different? And what about the speed? The speed at which it moves along the microtubule, how does that vary with different load features? So I'm presuming that's something that the team is going to investigate in the future, or maybe it's already in their paper.
I think what it boils down to is that we didn't have the capacity to even make these measurements until now. Now that we can, that's a question we can ask. It was a question we could ask but had no way of addressing.
Right.
Now we can actually address it. Because again, all the techniques we used before either required such long time to measure where things were that we lost any of the temporal, we couldn't look at speeds and stuff like that, or the loads we put on were so onerous that it changed the behavior of the molecule. Right. Now we can actually observe the molecule's behavior in its environment, the way it works, and actually get maybe answers to that question.
But as I understand it, this paper is basically looking at the movement of the molecule on the microtubule with what we would call a light load.
Or it's normal load, whatever it would be normally carrying. Because this is, like I said, this is operation within the cell. There's no longer we've had to take it out of the cell, put it onto a lab environment. There's nothing contrived about this. This is the kinesin 1 molecule operating in its natural environment.
But from what I understand, what you're telling me is the only load it's carrying are 1 or 2 of these phosphorescing molecules. Is that correct?
I think what it's doing, it's carrying whatever it is. We've just been able to attach a molecule to it.
Oh, I see. So we don't really know the load that it's carrying with any precision.
At this point, I don't know the answer to that. But my understanding, as I've read through the paper, is that the kinesin molecule is carrying a load. We figured out how to attach a fluorescent item to it
so we
while it's carrying the load.
Exactly. I get it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think this is exciting, Jeff, because, again, I'm thinking if we could actually look at the speed under various load features, this is where we can get some significant practical applications for the macro world.
Well, okay, kind of explore that a little bit, because I do find this fascinating just in terms of illuminating what's going on inside the cell. But how does that translate into macro features that you were talking about there? What are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking, I don't know if you've ever done a steeplechase or a cross-country race.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you got to kind of vary your gait depending what kind of obstacles, what kind of elevation,
Okay.
what kind of speed you want to achieve. I'm also thinking in terms of rail transport, trucking. Maybe there's something we can learn from here that would make it more energy efficient. And I'm always
That's an interesting question. So
I'm always amazed at how the human body seems to be optimally energy efficient when we're moving through terrain, regardless of what the terrain is. And it's like, it just seems to automatically adapt. And I'm curious, why is our human body so skilled at being able to, it's like we don't even have to think about it.
I know.
I mean,
I
why?
mean, I appreciated that a few years ago. One of our colleagues or supporters of Reasons to Believe happened to have some tickets to the DARPA robotics demonstration down at the Pomona Fairgrounds. And so I ended up getting a couple of the tickets. And so I took my family down and we were watching. The basic idea was there were different teams that they had built a robot that with relatively minimal feedback from the people. So they got little bits of data, they could make corrections, but this robot had to drive a car that had to navigate through, kind of zigzag through a course and not run into the wall. Had to get out of the car, walk over to a door, turn the knob, open the door, walk into the room, go over, turn a valve off, cut a hole in some drywall, walk across some uneven ground, and then climb some stairs. I mean, these are things that any 5-year-old can, well, outside of maybe driving the car, any 5-year-old just kind of intuitively knows how to do all those. You don't have to think about it. But yet building a robot to do that was incredibly difficult because you've got balance issues, you've got how do you sense the environment to know where you can step and adjust your foot? And as you said, our body just does it.
Yeah. So was this a bipedal robot or?
It was a humanoid robot.
Yeah, because bipedalism is not easy.
That was kind of what I was walking away from that.
Right.
Walking away from is that we take for granted walking, but that is a very complex task, and we do it without thinking about it. And as you've mentioned, we do it very efficiently. And I guess I wasn't thinking so much in terms of this as how do we scale it up and do things human level. But now, as we're trying to build nanomotors and things like that, we're able to draw insight from what I would argue the designs in nature to be able to build stuff at the nanometer level. Because very often what we do at the macro level, you can't scale down because it just doesn't work. And I generally tend to see that the other way. The nanometer or the micro scale doesn't scale up to the large.
Well, that's what's exciting about this is that this gives us the possibility of developing nanomachines that can go inside our bodies and do repair features at the nanometer level.
I find that both encouraging and terrifying at the same time, because the moment you get them in there, being able to get them out may not be so trivial. And so I could see, there's great opportunity here, but I could also see there's a lot of risk involved in that. So I'm excited and terrified at the same time for that.
Well, that's always the way it is with technology.
Fair point. Point.
Well, you
so that, I'm good. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I'm going to switch gears and basically go into your area of expertise. And it's about moons. And a paper just got published in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society saying we owe a lot to our moon.
Okay.
However, as we look at Earth or planet-moon systems, we realize far more probable is that moons orbiting your planet are going to do significant harm.
Okay.
And so it's basically talking about the catastrophes of moons orbiting planetary systems. But the author, Bradley Hansen, he begins by pointing out that we owe a lot to our moon. We're orbiting a big rock. We're on a big rocky planet, but we're orbited by a gigantic rocky moon. And it's because the Earth-Moon system formed as a result of two planets colliding with one another, leading to the formation of the moon. And, we're able to thrive here on planet Earth because of the huge ratio of the moon's mass to our planet's mass. It's, about 1.13%. And that's,
so just for scale, I mean, that doesn't, 1.1% doesn't sound like a lot. I know there are larger moons in our solar system, but what makes that special?
well, in terms of the planet or the moon-planet mass ratio, the Earth-Moon system has an advantage of 53 times over the next known biggest ratio.
That's pretty
The
impressive.
next biggest ratio is Titan and Saturn.
Okay.
Titan is more massive than our planet, but of course Saturn's way bigger. But the ratio of Titan's mass to Saturn's mass is 53 times less than the ratio of the moon to planet Earth.
So it's not that our moon is larger than, there are other moons larger in our solar system, but they're orbiting much larger planets, which kind of makes sense that you get a larger moon because of that.
Right. But it's because of that high mass ratio that we have a stable rotation axis tilt. It's also because of that high mass ratio that we've got tides that make for very abundant life around the continental shelves of the world, and also explains why a rotation rate has slowed down to 24 hours a day at the optimal time that the sun has maximum luminosity stability.
So what was I mean, you say it's slowed down. What evidence do we have, or why do we think it's slowed down?
Well, the collision between the planet Theia and the proto-Earth that led to the formation of a bigger Earth and the moon, that spins up the rotation rate of the proto-Earth. And there's some debate as what that initial rotation rate was, but something like 2 to 3 hours a day.
Okay.
And today it's 24 hours a day.
So it slowed down significantly.
It slowed down significantly, and the sun contributes to some of that slowing down, but the biggest factor by far is the moon. The tidal force is exerted by the moon. And the principle is this, is that the moon being so close to the Earth, its gravitational pull on the near side of the Earth is quite a bit stronger than the pull on the far side. And that acts as a brake on the rotation of planet Earth. But where
so that's part of why, even though the moon is much less massive, because it's closer, that phenomena is larger for the moon than it is for the sun.
Yes, because the sun is so much farther away. So, and it's just inverse square law. So, if you're close, it makes a big difference. And if we had a rotation rate of 23 hours, which is what it was 150 million years ago.
Okay.
We would have a very different climatic environment than we have today.
In what ways?
Well, because the planet would be rotating more rapidly, you tend to get more laminar cloud formations, which means you're not going to get an even precipitation fall or an even cloud cover over the whole of the planet.
So is it laminar in terms of there are layers where it's going to be, or laminar in terms of bands like Jupiter has?
Bands like Jupiter.
Bands like Jupiter has.
Yeah, because there'll be regions where you got high wind rotations. I mean, you see some of that around Antarctica because there's no continents to impede the flow. You get a rather continual laminar flow of wind and ocean currents. But because we have a 24-hour rotation rate, that has been minimized. On the other hand, if you go to 25 hours a day, that means it's going to be hotter at 2 p.m. than it would be if it's 24 hours, and it's going to be colder at 2 a.m. And so, and that temperature difference would be difficult for not just human beings, but for all life.
Right.
And so 24 hours a day is optimal for human global civilization. But the amazing thing is the moon slowed down our rotation rate to that optimal level at the same time that the sun's luminosity stability hit its optimal level. They both coincide. And so what Bradley Hansen did is say, these are amazing features that we have because of this big moon orbiting our rocky planet. But his real interest, and most of the paper is saying, what would be the case for extrasolar planetary systems?
Right.
And saying, we already know if you want to have a rocky planet where it doesn't lose all of its water and atmosphere because of the intense particle radiation of its star when the star is young, you're going to need a big moon.
Okay.
The big moon basically means that it has to be close. A big moon close to a relatively small rocky planet means you'll get a coupled magnetosphere,
Right.
which will prevent the sputtering away of water from the planet and its atmosphere.
That's a fairly new discovery too, has it
It's
not
a
been?
new
I remember
discovery.
you writing about that not too long
Right.
ago.
Well, Bradley Hansen made note of that, saying, hey, this is a new habitability feature. But he says, here's the problem. Given that we know this is a requirement for life on a planet, what's going to be the normative when you've got a rocky planet orbited by a large moon? And so what I've done in an article I'm writing on this is saying, well, what's the situation for our moon? It's spiraling away from the Earth. But right now it's spiraling away at about 3.8 centimeters per year. And that's going to continue. And eventually it's going to result, because of the moon's tidal forces on the Earth, and not only the moon being tidally locked to the Earth, but the Earth being tidally locked to the moon.
Okay.
But given the slow rate at which it's receding away from the Earth, we're looking at a long time in the future before that happens.
Right.
Somewhere between 40 and 50 billion years. However, what happens is you get that tidal locking, but there's still some inertia in the outward motion. So the moon actually goes a little bit past that distance where you get the tidal locking. And what happens is you get a reversal of the movement. So instead of the moon going out, it now switches directions and moves in.
Okay.
And if you wait long enough, which would be a little more than 55 billion years, the moon crashes into the Earth. And we'd all realize that would be a bad situation for life on planet Earth. But hey, 55...
I don't think Earth's going to make it 55 billion years
well,
in the
that's
first
the point
place.
that Bradley makes. He says, long before that happens, the sun becomes a red giant star and incinerates both the Earth and the moon.
Right.
So he says that scenario won't happen. However, he said, for extraplanetary systems, extrasolar planetary systems, you've got a much higher probability. Basically, it says...
So this is like a scenario around a red dwarf star where you've got an Earth-sized planet where somehow you get a moon-sized moon as well. So in a situation like that, where that star is going to be stable for 50 to 60 to 80 billion years, this sort of scenario now starts to play out.
Yes, although he says it's highly unlikely that we're looking at 40 to 50 billion years for exoplanetary systems. So he's basically looking at a random population of planet-moon systems where you got a rocky planet orbited by a big moon. And he says, no, that's highly unlikely to start with.
Right.
Because we look at Venus, it doesn't have any moons. Mars has got a couple of tiny ones that it captured.
Right.
And so Earth is an anomaly. But he says, realizing this is a habitability requirement, let's just simulate a population of these planets colliding such that you get a rocky planet orbited by a big moon.
Right.
And he says, what are the most likely scenarios? And he basically points out you get two highly likely scenarios where the moon spirals away from the planet, but at a higher rate than what we see for the Earth-Moon system.
Okay.
Which means the reversal point happens a lot sooner than 40 to 50 billion years.
What's a lot sooner? Are we talking 30 billion years, or are we talking 2
No, we're
billion
talking
years?
like something like half a billion.
Half a billion. Okay,
to
so
4 billion
noticeably,
years.
noticeably faster.
Shorter. But he says even more unlikely is the planet spirals away from the Earth, gets outside the Hill sphere of the Earth, and now becomes uncoupled from the Earth.
Okay.
However, it shares the same orbit around the star that the planet does. And so then he kind of goes off a little bit future, saying, okay, you got a planet that had a moon that was orbiting it,
Right.
where the moon now spiraled away far enough or it became decoupled. It was no longer gravitationally
Right.
attached to the planet, but was still gravitationally attached to the star.
Right.
So he says, what's the possibility or the probability that as this moon, decoupled moon and planet orbit around the star, that the moon gets perturbed by other planets in the system and winds up crashing into the planet?
I would bet it's pretty highly likely.
It is. Yes, it's highly likely that will happen.
Right.
And so that's kind of the theme of the paper that he published in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society. Yes, we have this incredibly fortunate circumstance where we live on a rocky planet orbited by a big rocky moon. However, if we look at what we would presume would be a random population of planet-moon systems where the planet is rocky and the moon is big, all of which form similar to a collision between Theia and the proto-Earth, it's highly unlikely you're going to get a stable system like the Earth-Moon system.
Right.
Far more probable it'll be unstable. And he says, if you're talking about microbial life that exists for a short period of time, no big deal. But if you want advanced life, you need a long history of life. And he says the problem is, the likelihood is you're going to get a collision of this big rocky moon with a planet long before life is sufficiently abundant and diverse and enduring on the planet where you can get the equivalent of advanced life. So he says this is another habitability requirement, at least for advanced life, that you need a big moon orbiting a rocky planet where it is stable, and his calculations show that is a remote possibility. So it's basically another habitability requirement that's been discovered.
Yeah, I find this discovery interesting for two reasons. One is there's been a lot of press over the last decade or so, as we found planets around these M dwarf stars, these red dwarf stars, because they tend to have Earth-sized planets. And it's not uncommon to find an Earth-sized planet in the liquid water habitable zone. And so it's like, oh, wow, here we're getting close to finding a habitable planet. What strikes me about this discovery or this discussion is that it really does seem like the moon is a critical feature of a habitable planet. And it makes sense why you have more Earth-sized planets around these smaller stars, because it seems like the larger a star is, the larger the planet it makes.
Right.
You tend to not have any Jupiters around these around these M dwarf stars.
Right.
Or it's less common, I guess I'll say it that way. And so the fact that we've got more Earth-like planets, that makes sense. But now you ask the question, okay, since you have more Earth-like planets, what are the moons more likely to be like? Well, if we just scale our solar system, you got Jupiter or Saturn, you're going to have moons that are 53 times smaller than what our moon is. So the likelihood of getting a moon is dramatically smaller around one of these M dwarf stars. So that's one thing I find interesting. The other part that I find interesting is that you need a moon, but once you get you need a large moon. Once you get a large moon, there's this second level of not only do you need a large moon, you need a large moon that is stable.
Yes.
And that seems like something new that we're just kind of running across.
It's a brand new, that's what excited me. Nobody that I know has ever worked on this problem before.
Right.
Of having a large stable moon around a planet. One thing he did address the M dwarf issue.
Right.
Basically saying if you're looking at M dwarf stars, small stars, the probability of getting a planet orbiting, a moon orbiting a planet in liquid water habitable zone is remote because of the the star is nearby. And so it's basically going to destabilize it and pull the moon into the star relatively quickly. So he says, basically what we're talking about.
That's another problem, yeah.
That's another problem, which is why he kind of focused on stars like the sun.
Right.
Because now you got the planets far enough away, they're in the liquid water habitable zone, where you now have a possibility of a moon forming and the moon being able to orbit that planet. In fact, what he calculated was it works for planets as close to the star as Venus.
Okay.
Once you get closer than Venus, forget it, which is why he basically said we have to be looking at stars like the sun. Because with M dwarf stars, if you're Venus's distance away, you're way outside the liquid water habitable zone.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating to find these M dwarf stars, but it always seemed like a little bit of a red herring to say, oh, we've got all these Earth-like planets around M dwarf stars, because it doesn't seem to account for some of the known. There's just a lot of problems that arise for habitability around an M dwarf star. I mean, you've got tidal locking that happens, and it's like, okay, well, maybe you've got circulation in the atmosphere on the planet, But this discussion of the moon really does seem to put a much larger damper on that, because one, you just naively, or I mean, even on first calculations, you don't expect there to be large moons. But even if you do get a large moon, to have it stable with the planet almost makes it unstable with the star, which means you got to have a larger, so there's all these things that really say M dwarfs are interesting, but they're not really there. And there's a lot of them, but they're not really the best candidates to look for a habitable planet.
In reading the literature on this, Jeff, I was wondering a couple of years ago, why isn't there a consensus amongst astronomers that M dwarf stars are bad candidates for life? There now seems to be that consensus in the literature. People are recognizing, okay, we need to prevent the star from sputtering away the atmosphere and the water. Well, if you've got an M dwarf star, you've got much more significant radiation when that star is young than we do with a star like the sun.
Right.
And of course, the planets are closer to the star.
Yep.
So that's another problem. And you have this incredible flaring activity and X-ray radiation. So I am encouraged that there now seems to be a recognition in the astrophysical literature, M dwarfs are not candidates to have planets on which life exists. I mean, it's kind of disappointing because there's so many M dwarf stars out there, lots of Earth-like planets orbiting them. And so this is what got people excited. Hey, but now we're realizing, no, we really need to go up higher and look at stars like the sun.
Well, and I do think the research into the M dwarfs is it's very important to do, because one of the things I realized a number of years ago is, they're kind of the two competing models of how life arises on a planet. There's kind of the minimalist model. You get these basics, minimal set of criteria, and then life arises. And then there's, I would put RTB, I haven't come up with a good term for it, but maybe a more maximalist model where there's a lot of things that need to happen. And so there's all these stringent criteria. You've got the two models, and both of them are plausible in a very real sense. But really the way to test them is to find scenarios in between Earth and something that's clearly uninhabitable, to find as many scenarios in there where it's closer or something looks good. So finding M dwarfs that are in the habitable zone, liquid water habitable zone, with an atmosphere where they might have the right temperature, that's important, because if we can now find planets like that and see whether they have life, that gives us data to decide which of those, instead of just making calculations, if you will, about what we think.
Well, I like what you're saying in this sense that I see in the astrobiological community the focus on trying to find places where life can exist. Just as important, in my opinion, is finding places where life can't exist. I mean, that tells us a lot.
Right.
And I would wish that our peers would be more focused on that. It's like, getting a yes answer or a no answer, both answers are important.
Well, so, I am sympathetic to that, though, because there are lots of places we thought life couldn't exist on Earth. And then lo and behold, we find life there. And so that's what I think the challenge is until we can actually determine whether there's life on a planet or not. And that's just going to, you and I both know that's just going to require more sensitive telescopes, better instrumentation, all this sort of stuff. So I think it's a fascinating problem that probably won't be solved in my lifetime. But I do think all that to say is that this research on these M dwarfs is really important, even though I don't think they're going to be good candidates for life, because being able to ascertain whether there's life there or not is a big piece of data that would really weigh in favor or in detriment to the
in one sense,
models.
I think the evidence is to the point where we can rule out M dwarfs, but coming up with more evidence to rule them out even more definitively, that's important to do.
I would agree with the one caveat that if we look at M dwarfs and there's life there, we don't say, ooh, it can't be life because our model said there couldn't be. So that's why I think actually making the determination of is there life there is important or not. But I agree with, I don't think we're disagreeing here. So.
Yes, and I think what Bradley Hansen has done here is saying things are way more complicated than we thought.
Exactly.
And
Which that's what makes it fun.
It does. But it's also kind of driving home the point that it takes a lot of design and fine-tuning in order for life to exist anywhere, including here on planet Earth.
Amen.
And the fact that it's so abundant here on Earth and so diverse just makes the point all the more clear. Our planet shouldn't have this great abundance and diversity, but somebody wanted it to have great diversity and abundance.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today on Stars, Cells, and God. Join the discussion in the comments below. Remember to like this video and to subscribe for more content. New episodes of Stars, Cells, and God release each Wednesday and are available here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Be sure to share this video with a friend. And remember, the more we know about science, the more reasons we have to believe in Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. Thank you.